In the 3rd millennium BCE, the great temple economies of Mesopotamia began to change. For nearly 1,000 years, the priests of Sumer had recorded every measure of grain and oil on clay tablets. The temple was the city's heart, its granary, its bank, its court of law. But by around 2500 BCE, new forces were stirring beyond the temple walls. The cities of Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and Mari were no longer isolated sanctuaries. Caravans crossed the desert with copper from Oman, timber from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and textiles from the Indus Valley. The world was becoming connected, and faith alone could no longer manage the flow of goods. A new class emerged, the Tamkarum, professional merchants. Some still served the temples, others traded for themselves. They carried silver, wool, and barley as currencies of weight, not divine offerings, but practical units of value. Around this time, King Ur-Nammu of Ur reigned 2112 to 2095 BCE, issued one of the first written law codes in history. Among its articles were precise commercial regulations, penalties for false weights, rules for contracts, protections for merchants and travelers. Trade was no longer just a ritual act, it was a civic one. The temples of Mesopotamia adapted. Many built warehouses that doubled as state-sponsored banks, lending seed grain in the spring and collecting repayment after harvest. Yet the new merchants pushed beyond their control. They began to organize trade networks independent of priests, driven by profit, not by piety. In the city of Lagash, tablets record merchants pooling capital for long-distance ventures. They sent agents to ports along the Persian Gulf and across the Zagros Mountains into Elam and beyond. A new idea was forming, that value could move and that trust could be negotiated between individuals rather than guaranteed by gods. The economy of Mesopotamia was still built on grain, oil, and metal, but now these goods circulated through agreements written in law. The temple scribes still recorded every debt, yet the ink of faith was slowly giving way to the ink of commerce. By 200 BCE, caravans departing from Ur were escorted by armed guards, carrying copper, tin, and textiles along the old trade roads that connected the rivers of Sumer to the highlands of Anatolia. These routes carried more than goods. They carried ideas. Measurement systems were shared, weights standardized, contracts translated. The Mesopotamian shekel, roughly 8 grams of silver, became a common unit across empires. In every city, markets grew beside the temples. The chants of priests mixed with the cries of traders. Barter gave way to calculation, trust to agreement. Humanity was taking its first step from a world ruled by faith to a world organized by trade. The merchant replaced the priest as the traveler of truth. The tablet still recorded promises, but now those promises belonged to men, not gods. And on those ancient roads of dust and copper, the first glimmer of a global economy began to shine. By the start of the 2nd millennium BCE, Mesopotamia had entered a new age of order. Across the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, trade flourished, but so did dispute. To measure was to argue over fairness, and to argue required law. Around 2000 BCE, the city of Akkad and its successors standardized the shekel, a unit of weight equal to about 8 grams of silver. It was no longer enough to trade grain for oil. Value had to be quantified, verified, and written. Silver became the yardstick of trust, the universal language of exchange. Temples and palaces kept their ledgers in barley and copper, but merchants now carried scales and weights on their journeys. Each transaction was a ritual of precision, metal balanced against metal, hand against hand. In the city of Sippar, clay tablets record the earliest contracts for the sale of fields and houses. The names of witnesses and scribes are etched beside numbers for silver and grain. Debt had become a legal matter, no longer judged by gods, but by courts. In Babylon, a new ruler rose, King Hammurabi, who reigned from 1792 to 1750 BCE. His code of laws, inscribed on a pillar of black diorite, spoke to a civilization governed by measure. It defined prices for grain and wool, regulated interest rates, set penalties for theft and fraud, and protected the rights of merchants and borrowers. "The strong shall not oppress the weak," it declared. But in practice, the law also ensured that debt would bind society together like mortar in a wall. Under Hammurabi, Babylon became the commercial capital of the ancient world. Merchants traveled north to Assur, east to Elam, and west to Mari, carrying silver and wool through a web of measured exchange. Shamshi-Adad I, king of Assyria, 1813 to 1781 BCE, extended these principles even further. He built trade colonies in Anatolia, establishing networks of Assyrian merchants who kept their own ledgers and issued their own receipts. Thousands of tablets from Kultepe in modern Turkey preserve their records: contracts, loans, interest rates, and profit shares. For the first time, commerce was governed by weights, numbers, and agreements between equals, not by the favor of gods or kings. A merchant could now trust a scale more than a priest. Yet the system was still fragile. Floods could erase a harvest. War could scatter a caravan. A king's decree could wipe out a debt. Each transaction was a calculation of risk as much as reward. Through these centuries, Mesopotamia taught the world a new truth: that trust could be measured, and that value could exist outside of faith. The shekel was no longer an offering to the gods. It was a promise between men. And in that promise lay the seed of every economy that followed. By 1800 BCE, Mesopotamia's merchants were no longer bound by the walls of their cities. Across deserts and mountains stretched a network of roads, river barges, and sea routes that tied together the first global marketplace. From the city of Ashur on the upper Tigris, caravans departed northward through the Taurus Mountains to the trade colony of Kultepe-Kanesh in Anatolia, in today's Turkey. There, Assyrian merchants set up houses, warehouses, and offices. They married local women, kept separate ledgers, and paid taxes to the kings of Anatolia. More than 20,000 clay tablets from Kultepe survive, revealing a world run by accountants as much as adventurers. They record loans, shipping contracts, partnership agreements, and even insurance clauses. If a caravan was lost to bandits or flood, the loss was divided among investors, the first faint echo of modern risk-sharing. Each merchant was part of a mushkanam, a family partnership that pooled capital and divided profit. Silver was invested, goods were purchased, and couriers carried tablets sealed in clay envelopes that served as receipts and promissory notes. These were the earliest bills of exchange, value on the move, guaranteed by reputation and record. Farther south, in Babylon and Mari, palace archives show the same patterns. Letters between kings mention tin shipments, trade debts, and diplomatic gifts measured in shekels of silver. Zimri-Lim, king of Mari, 1775 to 1761 BCE, maintained agents in every major city to monitor markets and report prices. The roots stretched far beyond Mesopotamia. Tin and lapis lazuli came from the east, copper from Cyprus, cedar wood from Lebanon, gold from Nubia, and textiles from Sumerian looms. By 1500 BCE, Egyptian ships sailed up the Red Sea to exchange goods with Mesopotamian traders. Along these routes, trust became a commodity. A merchant's seal, pressed into clay, was his identity, his credit score, his signature of honor. Cities prospered as crossroads of trade. Caravansaries lined the roads, offering food, rest, and new deals. Languages blended. Ideas traveled with cargo. The cuneiform script itself spread, used now not to praise gods, but to record profits. Yet commerce carried risk. Empires rose and fell along these same routes. When Hammurabi's Babylon collapsed, Assyria took its place. When the Hittites conquered Anatolia, trade paused, then resumed under new rulers. The system endured because value had become portable. It could survive the fall of kings. In this age of caravans and contracts, the world discovered a new kind of power, not divine or royal, but economic. The merchant no longer prayed for favor, he negotiated it. On these dusty roads of silver and promise, the foundations of finance were laid. Partnerships, credit, risk, and reward. Commerce had found its language, and that language was trust written in clay. By 1300 BCE, the great trade routes of the ancient world had bound 3 continents together. But along with goods, they carried something more powerful: the idea that value could live within matter itself. For centuries, merchants had weighed silver on scales and recorded numbers on clay. Now, silver and gold began to speak their own language. They were no longer merely measures of worth. They were worth. In the royal courts of Egypt, Hatti and Babylon, tribute and diplomacy were conducted in metal. Letters between Ramses II of Egypt and the Hittite king, Hattusili III. Record payments in gold of equal weight and purity. The treaty that ended their war in 1258 BCE, the oldest peace treaty known, was sealed not only in words, but in precious metal exchanged between empires. The Hittites of Anatolia mined rich veins of silver and traded it across the Near East. In Babylon and Assyria, rulers stored bars of silver in palace vaults as reserve wealth, the first state treasuries. In temples, priests weighed offerings of gold not for the gods' favor, but for economic accounting. The idea of intrinsic value was taking hold. The purity of the metal, the brilliance of its shine, the rarity of its source, these became guarantees of trust stronger than divine oaths. By the late Bronze Age, the kingdom of Lydia in western Anatolia was experimenting with naturally occurring electrum, a blend of gold and silver found in the rivers near Sardis. Merchants cut and weighed these nuggets to trade goods quickly without scales or scribes. Within a few centuries, this would lead directly to stamped coinage. But even here, the revolution had already begun. Across the Mediterranean, silver ingots circulated as international currency. In Ugarit and Byblos, tablets record shipments, measured not in sacks of grain, but in talents of silver. In Mycenae, merchants kept ledgers of metal inventories, the earliest prototypes of monetary accounts. Metal transformed commerce itself. Where a sack of grain could rot and a tablet could crumble, gold endured. It was eternal, untarnished, a perfect vessel for the human desire to preserve value across time. Yet with this new permanence came inequality. Wealth could now be hoarded, hidden, concentrated. Power passed from the temple's collective ledgers to the treasuries of kings. Debt lost its sacred balance and became political. Still, humanity had crossed a threshold. For the first time, value was no longer a promise or a measure. It was a thing. The merchant no longer carried symbols of trust. He carried trust itself, hammered and weighed in metal. The age of commodity exchange had reached its perfection and its end. Soon, rulers would mark these metals with their own seals, stamping not only purity, but power. Money was about to be born.